everybody joining us. Welcome to Ben's Digital Book Club, a monthly gathering looking at themes relating to Benjamin Franklin, the 18th century, and American history. This month, we will be talking to Michael Hattem about his book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, which illustrates how colonists' changing understandings of their British and colonial histories shaped the politics of the American Revolution and the origins of American national identity. Michael D. Hattem is a historian of early America with a focus broadly on culture and politics in the long 18th century. He is the Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute and the Yale National Initiative to Strengthen Teaching in Public Schools. Previously, he served as visiting faculty at the New School in 2017-2018 and as visiting assistant professor of history at Knox College from 2018 to 2020. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we always start our Ben's Book Club by asking the question of what led you to write about this topic?
Yeah, so the germ of the topic came from an undergraduate paper, actually, that I wrote at the City College of New York, where I was looking at the founding of King's College in New York City, which is now Columbia University. And there was a big debate in New York City over whether the college would be founded as a seminary, an Anglican seminary, or whether it would be a sort of more ecumenical type of college. And so I wrote about that debate. And when I was doing the research for it, I noticed that both sides of the debate in the 1750s were using lots of terminology from the 17th century to refer to one another, usually in an insulting way. Right. So like the Anglicans would refer to the dissenters as levelers and Oliver Cromwells, right? And the dissenters would refer to the Anglican leaders as Archbishop Louts, you know. And it got me thinking about, you know, the role of memories of the 17th century, of British history in the 17th century in the colonies, you know. And in that paper, I just sort of mentioned it in an offhand way, but it really stayed in the back of my mind for a while, so that when I got to grad school and was looking for a dissertation topic, you know, it was sort of ready at hand. And then I sort of expanded it to, I thought I was going to look at the role of British historical memory in the colonies up until about 1776. But then later I found this manuscript when I was working at the New York Historical Society. I was doing research there. And I found an unidentified manuscript of history of the American Revolution. And when I was finally able to identify it, it was a draft copy of the first 6 chapters of David Ramsey's History of the American Revolution, which was the most popular history of the American Revolution for most of the early 19th century. And I'm looking at the draft and I transcribe a lot of it. And then I compared that to the published version, right, which came out about 5 years later in 1790. And what I noticed was that the biggest changes were in the first chapter, which in the manuscript talked a lot about 17th century British history, right, as a sort of prelude to telling the story about the revolution. But by the time that it got to the published version, most of that was cut out. And it was replaced with like individual sort of short histories of the settlement of various colonies, right? And that manuscript and those changes in it is what sort of caused me to enlarge the scope of my project and really gave me the idea for the question behind the whole project, which is, you know, when and how did American colonists stop thinking of British history as their history and effectively create American history to replace it, right? So that became the overarching question behind the manuscript. And it really has this germ that goes back to a paper that I did many, many years ago.
Wow, what a find as a historian to find those documents and to be able to see the difference. That's something that I think all historians dream of, finding that. And I guess that was kind of the start of it, but what kind of other sources did you use to kind of figure that out, to plot the change in kind of the American identity?
Yeah, so So that was a really great find, because that manuscript had been unidentified. It was in the John Jay papers, and it had gotten to John Jay from his father-in-law, William Livingston, who was the governor of New Jersey during the Revolution. And I later found out that Ramsay sent a bunch of those copies around to people looking for feedback, like a sort of 18th century writers group, you know. So I was able to identify that manuscript for the first time, which was really good. But in terms of other sources, oh, the work that had been done previously on how Americans or on history in the Revolutionary and early national era, a lot of that scholarship was from around the bicentennial, you know, and a lot of it focused on what we might think of as like the 3 or 4 most popular histories that were written in that period, you know, of which Ramsay's is one. Another is like Mercy Otis Warren's famous history of the Revolution. But I wanted to really go beyond that, you know, and so my idea was, or I used this concept of what I call in the book history culture, right? Which is just like an umbrella sort of academic umbrella term for just trying to look at any and all representations of the past, right, that I could find. So I certainly didn't want to limit myself to just works, you know, historical works, or what I call histories of. And so I looked pretty much anywhere else that I could find people might be talking about the past or representing or using the past. And so if you think about like the first half of the book, which looks at the 1760s and 1770s, I use a lot of political writings, right? And it's really surprising. It was surprising to me in reading through the sources from that period, you know, pretty systematically, just how much history figured into the political discourse of that period, right? So many pamphlets that I found, you know, that just begin with these long historical arguments, you know, and disquisition. Because what I came to realize that is that it was because they were grounding their arguments about, you know, about their relationship to Parliament, about their relationship to the king, in their sort of shared British and colonial past. A lot of those debates were about the terms of settlement, right, and whether Parliament had authority over various colonies when they were settled and this type of thing. So I spent a lot of time reading through political literature during the imperial crisis to find them getting to history and how they were thinking about history change. And then in the early national period, it got much more interesting in a sense, because there were just a lot more types of sources, right? So it's not really until after the war ends that we see the emergence of like American poetry and American fiction and things like that. And so then I was able to trace, you know, the historical arguments or interpretations or characterizations and things like fiction and poetry and children's readers and textbooks and all those kinds of things. So it was I was able to use a broad range of sources, especially once we got to the second half of the book, and that it made it much more interesting in a sense, right, than just dealing with these historical works. But also what I was able to do was to get a sense of how arguments went from those historical works and how they sort of filtered out, right, to the more general population, which most of whom couldn't afford to buy books, right? So I would see arguments that were made in these histories, you know, reflected in newspaper essays or in, you know, short pamphlets or in historical fiction for that matter. So a wide range of sources to try to get at what I call history culture, and just to really try to understand how people in the 18th century related to the past, you know, how they understood the relationship between the past and the present.
Well, there's a passage in your book where you mentioned, I think it's Abigail Adams, who saw a painting of one of the battles of the American Revolution, was just shocked by how how bloody it was, basically. And I guess it never had crossed my mind before that although they would have lived through this period, unless you were involved directly in the fighting, you might not necessarily have known to what extent it would have been, the revolution would have been, and also just in terms of imagery of it, because you probably would have read mostly in the newspapers and that. So I don't know if the rise of the visual culture as well really showed a difference from the during the revolution, well, during the crisis to afterwards, and if you saw any kind of changes with that as well.
Yeah, the Abigail Adams response is really telling, because it depicted, it was one of John Trumbull's famous paintings of war scenes, and I think the one that she was looking at was the Battle of Bunker Hill, where General Warren was killed, and General Warren was the Adams family physician, and so it had a little personal meaning to her. But also you can see in the quote, that just the effect of seeing, scenes of the revolution depicted visually, had a real impact on her. And because it was not a highly visual culture, right, in the 18th century, the few images that were well known, like Trumbull's paintings, had a real outsized influence, right? If we think about some of the most famous images from that period are just portraits, right? Like Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, or even busts, like we go on to bust of Franklin for that matter, right? So the visualness, had a huge impact on how people thought about the revolution. And when people would buy prints of Trumbull's paintings, part of it was to see depicted in this grand way, it was sort of in this 18th century tradition of historical paintings, right? To see events that they participated in, and to see them depicted in that way, I think it's not a stretch, to see or to assume, that then had somewhat of a sort of reciprocal effect in how they remembered, those events. So yeah, the visual stuff, the limited amount of visual stuff that we have from the 18th century in terms of sources is really important.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the bust of Franklin, because we have a copy of the bust of Franklin here in the house. It's not an original, unfortunately, but we know that Benjamin Franklin actually sent this French sculptor while he was in France to go sculpt George Washington. So I think that it's interesting that there was already an understanding of how important it was to kind of preserve that kind of the history of the time. And I mean, you speak to it when you speak about that network of kind of painters, but also antiquarians and historians, and even figures of the revolution that kind of informed how it was remembered after the crisis. But I just kind of, this is a very timely topic, of course, because I think most people are kind of thinking about their how we remember the revolution, specifically today. But it's interesting to trace it from kind of its early beginnings just before the crisis came to a head. So I wanted to get kind of your take on kind of what we could learn from this historical and this memory of the American Revolution, both before and after.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is a really important takeaway, and that for these 18th century images, like say Trumbull's paintings especially, that still applies today, is that Trumbull did those paintings like the Declaration of Independence and the war scenes and Washington's resignation. He painted those in the 18th century and embedded in them were lots of messages, basically, right, that he was trying to send about these events, right? And people who saw the paintings in the 18th century would likely have, picked up on most of those, because they would have been obvious within their cultural context, right? But as time goes by, the way that subsequent generations look at those paintings and interpret those paintings is very different than what Trumbull originally intended, right? Or in many cases, it might end up being, they might be interpreted in a highly simplified way compared to what Trumbull, meant to convey. And that's really, that works for, artwork generally, right? But it also works for text, right? We read text differently over time. Franklin's autobiography is one of the best examples in American history of that, right? It's written in the 18th century to basically, expound the virtues of frugality, but also collective civic action, right? If we think about when he talks about founding the library company and the fire, the volunteer fire department, and things like that, the Pennsylvania Hospital. But of course, over the course of the 19th century, as the United States industrialized, Franklin's autobiography becomes a sort of rags to riches story, right? Like a Horatio Alger type narrative. And it's more about the individual than it is about collective action. It's more about making money, than it is about just being frugal as a virtue, that's what leads to Franklin becoming the sort of avatar of American capitalism by the early 20th century. So we read these sources, whether it's images or it's text, their meanings change over time because they're read in different contexts, right? And when it comes to the memory of the revolution, it's the same thing. So I'm currently working on a book that's a sort of long history of how we fought over the American Revolution, about the memory of the revolution. And it's the part of the reason that you can write a narrative history of that is because it changes, as circumstances change, how we remember the revolution has changed. So, the artwork like Trumbull is a really good reminder of that. But that's just the case generally for how memory works, right? We remember the revolution now very differently than people did, say, before the Cold War, but certainly, very different from how people remembered it in the early 20th century or the middle 19th century, and it's our context that creates those changes, So it makes it in the book that I'm working on. I tried to pick out some things that are consistent over time, but the main thing that's consistent is that we're always fighting about it, is that there's really no one memory of the revolution. And it's just something that we've always fought over, basically since it ended.
And of course, memory is faulty. That's just the nature of it. We don't, it's that, and over time it fades, and some things we remember that might actually not be what actually happened. But I thought it was very interesting how history was always used as kind of a tethering point, whether that's in terms of linking, the people in the colonies with England, or whether it's creating their own narrative directly after the revolution ended. So I wanted to kind of get your take on how that concept of history kind of really changed during this period.
Yeah, so before the imperial crisis, before 1760, say, colonists had a pretty deep emotional connection to the British past, especially the Glorious Revolution, right? The Glorious Revolution in the 18th century basically served many of the same functions that the revolution does or has in American history. It's this foundational event, right? That has that has founding principles embedded in it, right? In the case of the Glorious Revolution, about things like toleration and constitutional monarchy, and so colonists had this really deep emotional connection to the memory of the Glorious Revolution as being the thing that, set the foundation for the British Empire's success in the 18th century. But I sort of detail in the book how the political circumstances of the 1760s, 1770s, when Parliament and the ministry, wants to basically reform imperial administration, right, in a more sort of centralized, I think you could say authoritarian way, it leads colonists to start rethinking what they thought the Glorious Revolution actually did, right? They always thought that it had been, the source of the success and the freedom and the prosperity that they enjoyed, right? But now, having created this this dynamic of parliamentary supremacy, it was the Glorious Revolution that had really created the circumstances where Parliament could start to try to exert all this new authority over them. And so they started to think, well, maybe the Glorious Revolution didn't mean what we thought it meant, and I think that's a really discomforting sort of psychological event, right? And it has its own sort of contemporary analog nowadays. If we think, you think about like the 1619 project, recently, lots of Americans are now reconsidering what the American Revolution means, or what it should mean, and what its place in our sort of civic identity should be, right? So I think, if there's some analogousness there, that to my mind actually, leads me to be a little bit more sympathetic for what colonists were going through in that period, right? So over the course of the crisis, they really start to, rethink the meaning of the Glorious Revolution. And in the book, I talk about what I call the authority of the past, right? Which is part of the colonial culture that they inherited from England, from the 17th century. It's like they had because they lived in a common law culture, and because historical distance for them was truncated compared to today, right? Which is to say, like, colonists who lived in the 18th century, the 98% of them who lived on farms, they're really, like, their daily lives were not that much different from their ancestors who lived hundreds of years ago, So for them, hundreds of years ago would not have seemed as far in the past, right? Or as far from the present as it does to us today because of technological developments, which sort of inflates our sense of historical distance. So they had a really intimate relationship with the past, And the one thing that I would say about that is that, even though many colonists did not have a sort of a really deep knowledge of the history, say, of the Glorious Revolution, right? They didn't really need to have that to know, like, to have an emotional connection to the Glorious Revolution. It's just like today in the United States. We see reports every couple of years that show that shockingly low numbers of Americans can tell you what the amendments are to the Bill of Rights, or can, you know what I mean? But that doesn't stop them from having a real emotional connection to, say, the American Revolution, right? And it's a very similar dynamic in the 18th century. And because of this authority of the past, what they did was they looked back at the past as a way of explaining the present, right? Which is to say, in a common law culture, tradition, custom, precedent, right? Those are all legal terms, right? And so they expected that unprecedented things would not happen, right? Which is why when Parliament tries to institute all these unprecedented new laws in the 1760s, it has a very chaotic effect on colonial culture, And but what I found is that by the time that we get to the early national period after the war, you start to see them take a much more utilitarian approach, I think, to history. And so rather than looking at the present through the lens of the past, they really start to look at the past through the lens of the present, right? And start to make the past useful, right, in their current context. And that's something that has continued ever since. So it's a major change in how I think Americans have related to the past that occurs over the course of the Revolutionary era.
And I think you mentioned the book, which I think is really fascinating, is when they were creating this kind of national history, is this idea of creating the narrative of, for example, Columbus discovering America, and how that was a big part of it because it actually bypassed all the British history, essentially. So I think that if you wouldn't mind just kind of expanding a little bit about how utilitarian it actually was, because I thought that was very interesting, that particularly.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good example, right? If you asked like a British American colonist in the 1750s, you know, who discovered America, they would probably say John Cabot or Henry Hudson, you know. They wouldn't say Christopher Columbus. I mean, he was a, what we would later call an Italian, you know, who had sailed for Spain and who never set foot on the North American continent, you know. But after the war ends in the late 1780s, early 1790s, there is a group of mostly men, but not only, but mostly, who I call in the book cultural nationalists, right? And these were individuals who understood that to bind these 13 states together would require, you know, creating something of a shared national culture. And of course, the creation of a national history is a big part of that project, right? And so these cultural nationalists saw 1792, which is the 300th anniversary of Columbus, as a real opportunity, right, to basically manufacture an origin story for the new republic that transcended the history of, you know, of Britishism, basically, right? Wasn't the history of European imperialism, right? But just to transcend their British origins was important, you know, especially because when we talk about like culture in the early national period, you know, it's not like Americans woke up on July 5th, 1776, and they were Americans, right? That's a process of stopping thinking of yourself as a British subject and starting to think of yourself as an American citizen is a long process, you know, that took a couple of decades, really, you know. And so that's this idea of sort of turning Columbus into the origins of the new republic, you know, sort of arises because this anniversary is coming. And it's only shortly before that the Massachusetts Historical Society is established. And so there are events in Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York, in Charleston, all four of the major cities, in Baltimore, to celebrate and commemorate this 300th anniversary of Columbus, with the goal of turning him in the public's mind into the discoverer of the United States, basically, right? And it's kind of interesting. In Baltimore, they erected like an obelisk, right? They erected one of these in New York, but it was taken down a few years after. But they erected one in Baltimore that had the inscriptions on it and everything. And that it's still there, the obelisk, though it was defaced during a protest a few years ago. I think it was after Charlottesville, you know, and these sort of anti-Columbus Day protests, you know. But the part of what's ironic about that is that, you know, why the colonists were adopting Columbus and the Columbus story was because they thought it was sort of, it would make them less Anglo-centric. And of course, the critique now is that the Columbus story is too Anglo-centric, right? So you see how these symbols, just like text and images, you know, the meanings of them change over time.
Oh, definitely. And I think also there was something that there seemed to be a real emphasis on educating the young about kind of the history of the revolution as well, which will then feed into that, because if you're teaching the women and hence the mother of the children about the history of the revolution, so continuing that narrative. So it helps with that, in the sense that if you're feeding the same story over and over again, it eventually just gets passed on. And so I thought it was interesting that there was an emphasis on everybody being educated about the history of the revolution too.
Yeah, when like right around the tercentenary in 1792, I think I quote a few letters in the book from Noah Webster, who produced many of the most popular sort of children's readers from the period. And his reader, one of his main readers, starting in the late 1780s, would begin with the Columbus story, right? With a woodcut of a ship, and then it would be followed by like the story of John Smith and Pocahontas, and a lot of these stories that I learned in school, in grade school in the 1980s, that were a product of the 1780s and 1790s, were still being taught, and part of the reason that that's important is that it allows us to realize that these historians and others like antiquarians or people who wrote poetry or fiction that drew on historical themes, right? In this period after the war, they really set the terms for what quote unquote American history would be for generations, for centuries, really. What that American history meant, began with Columbus, went through the settlement and development of the 13 mainland North American colonies, not the Canadian colonies, not the Caribbean colonies, right? Not the colonial history only extended to the Ohio Valley, not to like the Spanish settlements in the Southwest, or indigenous communities throughout the continent, right? So they set these sort of chronological and geographical boundaries on what American history was, and it's really only in the last few decades that academic historians have like really made it part of their mission to expand how we think about early America, and to not think about it as just 13 British colonies, and to think about what was going on in the rest of the continent, and to try to understand how that related to what was happening in the British colonies. So they had this huge effect on how Americans for centuries would think of what quote unquote American history meant and what it was. So that's part, I think, of its significance to us, like the importance of the story basically that I'm telling in the book, which is about the creation of American history, really, and why it's a significant story for us today, because in a lot of ways we're still trying to overcome the boundaries that they set in the Revolutionary era.
Absolutely, and of course back then nobody would be standing at the border of the 13 colonies and said, oh, you're entering American territory here. So this is where it begins. It's also important to remember that, of course. But taking it back a little bit to more of the British connection. I know that a lot of the founding fathers wanted to have some sort of connection to the British past. And for example, I know, Benjamin Franklin, he lived in London for many years, but he also went to his hometown, his family village in Ecton in North Hampshire. And so why would you think that the founding fathers would have wanted to have that connection, considering that in this kind of period of unrest, especially?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that's important to understand about colonial culture, and especially among elites, is that they lived with a constant sense of their own inferiority, right? Like relative to elites in England or Scotland, for that matter, right, in Britain. You know, the estates of the nobility in England, you know, were really made even the largest plantations in Virginia look, you know, tiny, you know. And so they had this sense of that they had this feeling that they were just as British as any other Britons, right? Whether they were in colonies or back home. But they seem to be constantly reminded of the fact that they were really culturally a step below, right? Native born Britons, and especially elites. And so one of the ways that they tried to deal with that sense of inferiority, besides through, you know, consumption and debt, you know, but one of the ways that they tried to deal with it was to trace their family lineage back to England, right? In the hopes of, they all had hopes of finding out that they were somehow distantly related to some, you know, noble, you know, or some family of nobility or something like that, which was rarely the case. So, you know, I have examples of, like, you know, George Washington did that in like the 1750s. And because Washington came from a not especially prominent family in Virginia, you know, so he sort of has this double layer of inferiority, you know. And so what these elites would do, and Franklin was one of them, they would, you know, hire a genealogical researcher in England to research their family origins, often with the hopes of finding like a family crest, you know, that they could then use. And they spent, you know, not insignificant amounts of money to hire these people to look for these things, to look for their genealogical information, you know. And all of that was with the idea of trying to find something that would allow them to not just to project a greater sense of cultural status, right, or genealogical status, but also just for their own, in their own minds, right, so that to sort of assuage the inferiority that they were sort of constantly being reminded about. So a big part of it, that's a big part of why they did that. What's interesting is that a lot of that seems to end after the revolution, you know. Though one of the ways that we see it continue, though not going back to England, is in New England, right? Where a new ruling class emerges in New England after the revolution that's based on genealogy that could be traced back to like the original settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, right? And if you have distant relatives who were part of the original settlers, or just from the first decade even, you know, then you had somehow a greater claim on, you know, the elite status of you know, New England society. So it's one of the things I think that's important about that is that, you know, when I talk about history culture, right, it's important to realize that, you know, genealogy is an important part of that, you know, and still today, you know, like lots of Americans, you know, we go through sort of cycles of like the popularity of genealogy, but we're in a time right now where it's, you know, increasingly popular, and there are all kinds of contemporary contexts that help explain why that is, right? Another big jump in interest in genealogy and family history, you know, came around the turn of the 20th century when immigration to the United States was, you know, at unprecedented levels, right? And that's also when you get the founding of like a lot of hereditary societies, like the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution. And it's the same principle as George Washington looking for noble, you know, ancestors in England, is, you know, Americans looking for ancestors who they could verify fought in the revolution. You know, it's a very similar dynamic.
Well, there's even going back deeper than that, there's even the Pilgrims who can trace their connection all the way back to there. And I guess that goes continuing with that kind of the settlement, the idea of settlement and how important it was to the actual kind of history of the nation. But if they were, I mean, if they were trying to find their connection to the kind of a British past, it really must have been a shock for them when all of those reforms happened in the 1760s, like the Stamp Act, which kind of, I guess, was sort of like a punch in the gut, so to speak, because they were, you know, they thought that they were connected to this past for because of that, you know, through their lineage or you know, whatever it may be. And so it must have. Do you think American history might have developed differently if there hadn't been that kind of situation? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would think. I mean, this is a counterfactual, right? So, I mean, I'm guessing about something that didn't happen, but I think that what I found from researching and writing the book is that the way that American history was created and the terms on which it was created and the ways that it was disseminated, you know, were utterly dependent on like the context of the revolution, whether it's the coming of the revolution with the, you know, the imperial crisis and the new legislation, or, you know, the experiences after the war of trying to, you know, knit these 13 disparate states together, you know. So in my mind, I can't possibly separate, you know, American history from the creation of American history from the context of the American Revolution, right? So if, you know, it's a counterfactual that people bring up always, like every July 4th, it seems like if Britain had not passed any of those, you know, new taxes or duties in the 1760s, like, would we still be British today? You know, like those types of counterfactuals. And I mean, I have no idea what the answer to that is, but I do know that the way that American history was created was utterly dependent on the circumstances of the revolution.
And that makes sense. Yeah, no, of course, because you needed to have a big moment for there to be the need to establish kind of a new narrative in the history.
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen. And now that I'm writing a book about the memory of the revolution that spans from 1800 to the present, and so I'm taking an even longer sort of, you know, long-term view. I think, you know, at moments where, you know, really significant changes in how people think about the past, those tend to occur in times of when some other kind of conflict or significant change is happening, basically. Whether it's civil war in, you know, in the 1860s, or mass immigration in the 1900s, 19 teens, you know, or the Cold War in the 1950s, per se, you know. So it does seem that, like, in moments when people feel a lack of stability or a lack of, you know, certainty, or just a sense of uncertainty, that they often turn to the past, right, to provide some kind of anchor as they're trying to navigate these, you know, unprecedented and unstable times that they're living in. And that's, you know, those are the moments when, you know, really big changes can happen in the way that people think about the past. Sometimes those changes might end up being small. Sometimes they're much larger, you know, but usually when things are stable and people feel pretty certain about where they are and where they're going, they have less of a need to, you know, to latch on to the past, you know, in some hardcore way, or to rethink it for them. So.
Well, we have time for some audience questions. I'm used to saying visitors in the context of Benjamin Franklin House. So please do have them come in. So the first question that we have is from an anonymous attendee, but they say, when you spoke about the colonists beginning to feel like American citizens, that made me think about all the immigrants to America who often felt a strong sense of patriotism, often stronger than Americans from birth do. What do you think is the state of patriotism in America today?
Well, that's a really deep question. I think that what's happening in the United States today in terms of our political division, right? And the way that patriotism sort of maps onto that is, and this actually is a dynamic that goes back at least to the 19th century. The different ends of the political spectrum in the United States, people on different ends of the political spectrum, tend to define patriotism differently, right? So for conservatives, and this is the case going back to the 19th century, conservatives have generally, there are exceptions of course, but generally speaking, conservatives see patriotism as, or they see the way of expressing patriotism as, sort of, for lack of a better word, worshiping individuals like the founding fathers and institutions, right? Whereas going back to the 1840s and abolitionists, the sort of the left end of the political spectrum has basically seen patriotism, has expressed patriotism as a commitment to sort of more fully realize the ideals of the revolution, as it were. And those are two very different, right, definitions of patriotism, and both very different in practice. And so I think it leads to a lot of discussions where people end up talking past one another, and especially in our current political culture. But I think it's like a lot of things. It really matters how you define a term like patriotism or nationalism, for that matter. I think we have competing visions of patriotism in the United States that have a long historical background.
And that seems to be the common theme. It's the historical background and how it relates to the past, which I guess plays a big role in the context as well of how people define it. So
So go.
No, I was just going to go. You feel free to. I was just going to ask the next question, but go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, I would say a lot of the debates that we're having in the United States right now, especially about the memory of the American Revolution, there was just a story in the New York Times and Time Magazine this week about these, public debates that we're having. A lot of what we're fighting over about the American Revolution, is common to earlier, conflicts that we've had in our political culture about the revolution. So not much necessarily about these debates is new, but what is new is the context, right? So we know what the outcome of fighting over these types of things was in the 1950s, right? But even though we've had these fights before, because the context of our current circumstances is new, we can't possibly predict what the outcome of these fights will be this time. Do you know what I mean? So even though we constantly fight about these things, and that never changes, but the context changes, and that's what makes it really impossible to predict, what the outcome of these fights will be at any given time in the present or future.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue into the next question. I think people are very much interested in kind of how this manifests in present day. And I'm sure this is something that you tackle in your next book. But what is your view on kind of controversial historic symbols like statues, for example, and how they should be handled in present day?
Yeah, I mean, so I use the example of the Columbus statue or the obelisk, right? That's the kind of thing where what it was meant to symbolize when it was put up in 1792 was one thing, and what it means when somebody looks at it now in 2021, it means something very different, right? And I think that that matters. And so for that reason, I am very reluctant or hesitant, to make some kind of general pronouncement about that kind of thing. I don't think it's historians' place to tell people what, American to them. You know what I mean? That's part of our civic responsibility as Americans, as citizens of the United States, is to decide what American history means for them. And so I think when it comes to the statues, like I'm mostly inclined to think that that really should be left up to the various communities that these statues are in, right? One of the ways that a community or a society, but in the case of statues, let's say community expresses its values is through symbols like statues and things like that, right? And so, if a community just determines that a certain statue that is, a certain older statue now no longer symbolizes the values that it wants to project about itself, then I don't see any reason why any historian should tell them, you can't take that down. You know what I mean? The ways that we make memory, public memory, collective memory, happens on not just a national level, it happens on a community level, it happens on a family level, on a personal level, right? And so, I think it's, with the statue specifically, I think that's up to each community to determine what they should do with that. I kind of cringe when I see historians say it should be taken down or it should be left up. Either way, I don't really think it's our place as historians to tell communities, how they can express what they want to express about themselves. You know what I mean? So that's a product of the work that I've done in memory and thinking about the relationship between the past and the present and how it changes over time. I feel like it's made me more not aware, but I'd like to think it's made me a little bit more thoughtful about these issues that in our political culture today are highly emotional and like real hot button issues that can be hard to take a step back from. So I hope that my working on the book has helped me do that. And I hope that anybody who reads the book, maybe will get a little bit of that out of it, to be able to step back a little bit and think about, the long stretch that all this has been going on. The reason I say that too, why historical context about these fights over the past is important, is because, if you think that everything you're fighting about is like brand new, and nobody's previous generations have not thought about these things, it unnecessarily ups the stakes, right? If you think you're the first generation to fight about the American Revolution or about statues, then you think that the outcome of that is all on you, and the stakes, that the whatever the debate is you're fighting about, is what the future of the republic is going to hinge on. You know what I mean? Like we've been fighting these fights for 250 years, and like I think that perspective is useful, if only for lowering people's sense of the stakes that are involved. Which is not to say that these debates aren't important, right? For our civic lives, for our civic identity, they are. They're very important, but they're not they're not necessarily, or at least I should say, up until now, they have not been, necessarily in most cases, the fulcrum on which the sort of republic turns. So I hope people will come away with a sense of that from the book.
Well, I really think that the old adage is true. History does repeat itself. So, the same conversations we've had, we'll probably continue to have going forward as we develop more of a collective memory and things change and more things come to light. The work's not done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This is all the time we have for Ben's Digital Book Club. Thank you very much for those of you who have sent in questions, for those of you attending. We have recorded this session, so this will be available on our website, www.benjaminfranklinhouse.org. I would suggest, if you haven't already, to buy the book. I hope that this has given you an interest in buying it for yourself. The next Ben's Book Club that we have in August will be actually a family version of it. So it's based on a book called The Ben of All Trades. And I would suggest, if you have any young ones in the house, tune in for that. Our education manager will be leading that one. But thank you again to everybody for attending, and have a good rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you, everyone.